and wanted to talk today about materials, which is a new feature in 2021 and one that I'm really just starting to scratch the surface on. So my expectation is that by the end of this little chat, you'll probably have as many questions as answers. That's okay. This is a little project that I did a few years ago, and I think that I've probably used as the basis for a couple of user group meetings because it's got a few little things in it, like a building, but it's not so cumbersome that it would just take forever to go through all the pieces. Little shed, and what I got a little crazy with this little shed model. This looks pretty normal, but what I did is I actually did the framing and modeled that as well, because I wanted to be real specific with my framer on this, which just full disclosure, that's not something I would normally do, is show all the blocking and so forth, but or even all the studs. But for our purposes today, that's kind of a nice thing. So I'm going to go to the resource manager, and we're going to look at the materials for this file. And these are all materials that I have just imported from the Vectorworks libraries. I may have tweaked one or two very briefly. And so you'll see if you go to the resource manager that materials are now a new kind of resource. They sit right below line types and right above record formats, because of course they're all sorted alphabetically. And so these are some materials that I just grabbed really quickly for today's purposes, so that we could play around with them and go ahead and look at them. And so you'll see that oftentimes materials that come from Vectorworks directly will have this suffix MT for material, obviously. And so if I just right click on one and edit it just as a means to look at it, you can see that this is what a material resource looks like. It has a name, it has a description. You can give it a mark and a keynote. It can have a fill and a surface. So this part here looks a little bit like a class definition, right? You can also report that material as a volume or as a surface area if you have a component area. And you can give it an omni class and a reference number and a short description, some product data. And you would do this because you wanted to eventually produce a detailed report. Then the other nice thing about materials is that you can assign them, or they come with physical properties right out of the box, a specific gravity or a specific heat, if you're interested in that, emissivity, albedo, and so forth. In this case, what I'm really interested in is density and maybe lambda, which is the value for Energos calculations for thermal conductance. And then you can also assign some custom fields, so you can customize your materials any way you want. So for example, there's a product cost here, but maybe there's some cost information that is a little more detailed than just a general cost per unit. And so you could create a custom record format and then attach that format to a material. So there's a whole lot here under the hood, and I'm not going to get to everything, but this will hopefully be sort of an introduction to the basic principles involved. And the idea, of course, is that you're able to assign multiple materials to multiple objects in order to have a better control over your model and drawing. So let me go back to this real quick. So notice that, and I did edit this one, notice that there are two sort of general areas regarding the material. There's the fill, so that's its fill in 2D, or if it has no texture in 3D. And then there's a surface texture that you can apply, either a class texture or none, or just assign it a texture, right? And notice that there's no line weight. So line weight for materials is controlled really by class. And then the material is governing the object's fill at its 3D texture. So we can already see that there are some of these material properties that are, for example, let me go over here to component. I'll go to my, I've got a structural beam wood class. Let me edit that. And so I've got graphic attributes, right? This is just a regular old class like we're used to. I've got graphic attributes here, fill, and textures, right? Happen to use the same material. So I tend to have like a whole series of material classes, like galvanized steel, clear, stainless, whatever. You know, there might be a dozen or so for a given project. And those classes are just there really to control not partly the visibility of objects, but really their three-dimensional appearance, so that everything will appear the way I want it to in the model. And so what this new feature, this new resource materials does is it eliminates the need for having all of these material classes, because now you could have, say, a stucco material and you could apply that to a wall component, or you could apply that to, well, primarily a wall component. Anything that requires that material. And if you change the material for definition in your file, everything that material has been assigned to is going to change accordingly. So, so what does that look like? Well, here's an example of a framing member. Let's look at that in the object info palette here. Right, there it is. So this is actually a structural member. You can see that I did put it in a class, and I've got some settings for it like you would any structural member, its usage and what type it is and its dimensions and so forth. And notice that under 2D attributes, I have set attributes by material. So I could set the attributes by object, by class, by line style, or by material. So I'm going to set it by material. And then the 3D attributes also are going to be set by material. Now, if you're wondering what about member and cover, that's just a feature of the framing member that you can have a cover component. For example, if you had fireproofing over a steel column, that would be a separate component of that plugin object that is covered, that you could assign a separate material to. So the structural member will accommodate materials both for the 2D fill and the 3D texture, as well as assigning any kind of data that you would want. In this case, I'm kind of interested in the weight, right? Not every member or every plugin object will do that. So let me go ahead and group this and go into the group real quick, right? So for example, right, if I wanted to create an extrusion, I'm just going to trace over this. And let's go ahead and extrude that by 1.5 inches. Okay. I could go ahead and you can see in the object info palette here, there is a checkbox for use material, and I can assign a material to it, and there are all the materials that are in my file. So there it is. And so now I've got an extrusion, I've got a structural member. They look the same pretty much in this 3D view. Obviously, in a top plan view, they're going to be different. Now I could make an auto hybrid out of this extrusion. I could make a symbol out of it and draw the 2D component and so forth. So simple, or basic Boolean geometry, extrusion, sweeps, additions, subtractions, all of these things can take materials, not just a plugin object like the structural member. On the other hand, let's go back to this view. One of the little tricky things that I did in this model, let me go ahead and group this wall. Yeah, I know, I've probably broken something. Just as a means. So one of the tricky things that I did in this model is the way that I did the framing is I created a curtain wall style. I'm kind of straying slightly off topic, but we'll get there. I created a curtain wall style. So let's look at that wall style, and I'll go ahead and edit the style. And you can see that I have frame settings, and I have panel settings. Now in this case, I have no panels because I'm using the curtain wall to simulate a 2x4 stud wall construction. But if I go to my frame settings, you can see that for each of these frames, the vertical, the horizontal, the start and the end boundary, all of these, I've assigned this wood SPF framing material to all of those. Right? And there's two good reasons for that. One is, again, for purposes of rendering, I can just change the material and everything that's been assigned to that material will change accordingly. But also for purposes of reporting, the material has become a kind of a tag that is attached to this object, which is going to make reporting a lot easier for this particular application. So here's another example of a fairly complicated or complex object, a wall style, where I can apply a material to one of the components of the wall, right? I'll cancel that. I got a little tricky in this model, and the way that I made the openings for the doors is I created a door in this curtain wall, and I just gave it a big lintel and called that a header. So I'm cheating a little bit. It could be that there's just something here that I've missed, but as I was poking around, I did not see a way to assign materials to plugin objects or to this particular plugin object, namely this door. So it could be buried in there and I've just missed it. I'm happy to admit that, but so far I have not discovered that. So if anyone would like to correct me, please do. Likewise, the structural member will allow me to assign materials, but the framing member, which is an older tool, I wouldn't say it's quite a legacy tool, but it predates the structural member. The framing member tool, which is in the detailing palette. Here's the framing member tool right here. That also does not allow you to assign materials. So just be aware that not every single tool in Vectorworks is going to allow you to assign materials to it. Probably a good rule of thumb is the newest plugin objects like the structural member or curtain walls, those are, And then older plugin objects may not, like, doors and framing members. And then just basic 3D geometry is going to allow you to assign those kinds of assignments of material. So so just be aware of that. Any questions so far about sort of the concept?
How does material?
I'm asking questions as
a class anywhere.
What's that?
Well, how does material affect the class? Or the if you have a class, let's say for framing members, and then you put a material in it, does that change the visual attributes of that overall class, or is it specific to that?
Yeah, classes don't have materials.
Right, the way you set it up, you made it so that it did have materials, but now you don't have to do that any longer because we have a subheading that's basically materials. Is that right?
Exactly. Yeah. So materials and classes are not, one is not the sub of the other. They're completely different things.
Right.
Right. So you can't assign you can't assign a material to a class. That you could assign some class attributes to a material.
Got it.
Francois, that wouldn't allow you though then to turn off and on like you can classes, right? I don't want to see that. If you started doing that with materials, it could be problematic.
Yeah, materials are not, as far as I can see, materials are not a substitution for classes. They're really something separate that's intended to fulfill a different function. So anything having to do with 2D line graphics or visibility, I would do by class, right? I wouldn't do it by material. For one thing, there's no, if you go to your visibility tool, right? There's no way to toggle visibility by material. It's visibility by layer or by class. So you don't control visibility with material.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, Don, were you going to ask another question?
No, that was it. Thanks.
Okay. Yeah. So. Go ahead.
It looks like there are different ways, multiple ways to assign material to objects. One is in the object info, you can assign or pick materials into that project, that object. Is there any other way? Like, do you mind to do a quick summary of different ways to assign materials to objects?
Yeah, the other way that you can do it is you can just drag and drop the material onto the object, but that's not going to be, so for example, here I'm in this little group. I'll just go ahead and draw a rectangle. Right, so I could just drag this, let's make it concrete. Let's see what that looks like. Boom. So I can just drag the concrete onto this block. It's very convincing. It looks terribly heavy, right? So that'd be a very easy way to do that, just drag and drop, right? But I'm not sure that would really work on this framing member, for example, or this structural member. Here's a structural member, right? I mean, let's try it. Yeah, no. And the reason for that is that this is a fairly complicated or complex object. And so it's giving you a lot of control as to how you apply the material. Are you applying the material to the structural core? Are you applying the material to the cover? Are you applying the material for the fill only, or just the 3D texture, and so on and so forth. So because the tool is designed to be so nuanced, Vectorworks isn't going to let you just drag and drop a material onto it because it has no idea what you want to do with that. Does that make sense? So basically,
Yeah.
it's drag and drop, or from the object info palette, or from within the control parameters of the plugin object if it's a plugin object.
Oh, I see. Thanks.
Yeah, good question. So here's another, no, that's a rectangle. Here's a slab. It's just a sheet of plywood, right? Or multiple sheets of plywood. So let's look at that. I didn't even bother to style it. So I just have an 1 1/8" plywood here. And if I look at the component and edit that, you can see that like the frame, the 2x4 stud wall, curtain wall definition, I'm assigning a material to this particular component, right? And so that's the plywood sheathing material. And so I could override that texture and make it by class or no texture, or I could just revert to the material texture. And in this case, I've got a slab that just has one component. So I'm not getting any settings for the overall slab. If I had multiple components, then I could assign separate materials to the components. So here's an example of that. Let's go over to the perspective here. So let's see if I can break something. So here's my roof and metal deck. Let's go ahead and edit that style and have a look at it. So this is just a shed roof that I made quite a while ago. And so it's got a 1/2 inch of sheathing, and then I'm showing about 1 inch of standing seam metal roof. And because this is an old object, there are no materials to it because it predated material. So I'm going to go ahead and edit the decking here. And I'm going to go ahead and use a material and assign the plywood sheathing. I'll go ahead and update this to be load bearing, and perhaps I'll just leave the class alone. Right. And so the texture, I'm just going to let it be at the texture that's assigned by the material. Nothing else really changes. So I'll hit OK. And then for the roofing, again, let me edit that. And you can see that I can assign a material here. And I've got a standing seam metal roof. There's the texture that's associated with it. Right. And that'll be the outer finish. And there we go. And so you can see there's now a material column in my roof style that assigns that material to the various components. Right? And I can use component textures, and I'll hit OK. And it's just replacing it with itself. And there we go. Hopefully that looks right. Yeah, nice. Now, of course, like anything else, right? If I decide that I want to change this roof style, I can edit the style, and maybe instead of a roof, metal, and deck, I'll call it a roof, shingle, and deck. And for the roofing, instead of this material, I'll choose, I think I have a sheathing. There we go, asphalt shingles. And there's that. I could probably change the thickness to something a little more reasonable. And there's my asphalt shingle version of that roof. And notice that I didn't need to change the class of any of the components. So, you know, right now the way we have our class structure set up is we kind of have a different roof class for different kinds of roofing material. whether it's metal or shingle or a membrane or whatever. Whereas with materials, we could just have like a roof, just a roofing class, right? And then for each different roof style, we could assign a different material to that roofing component, and that would sort of simplify matters. And of course, materials and styles are a lot easier to sort of import from document to document. I'll reassign that. There we go. I'll keep that as a metal roof. So a great place to start looking for implementing materials are sort of component-based objects like slabs, like roofs, and walls. So yeah.
So, and don't all of the material components also have a line quality? So if you're doing like a hidden line rendering or whatever, if you're not doing something that's OpenGL, that those things are embedded in there too?
Yeah, so let's look at that. So the roof, the standing seam roof, right? Let's edit that and look at that. You can see that for fill, it has solid, and then it's got a texture associated with it, but there's no line weight here, just fill. And there's no, I mean, notice that it's a solid and there's no hatch associated with it, right? So a good question would be, well, then how come in this hidden line rendering, why am I seeing the seams of the standing seam roof? Right?
Right.
Yep. And the reason for that is because of the texture. Let's look at the texture. So let me just remind myself what texture we've got in here. It's the roofing standing seam 12-inch. Okay. Renderworks textures. So where'd you go? Nested textures. I hate this. All right, so there it is. This is the texture that is assigned to that material. Okay. And if I look at that, you can see that for the surface hatch that's associated with the texture, there is a hatch that has been given to that texture. And it's by virtue of the hatch associated with the texture that's associated with the material. That's why you're seeing those lines for the seam. And if I decided that, you know, what I really want is I want a 17-inch spacing instead of a 12-inch spacing. And then likewise here, I might multiply that by 1.7. Maybe just make it 10. Something like that. And so now the spacing is a little wider, a little more like what you'd expect. But that's all a function of the hatch that is in turn associated with the texture.
Am I understanding it correctly? So the texture versus the material, the texture is the look you see when you render the model. And
Yes.
okay, and can we add another texture to the material if we don't like the default looking of the material texture? Can we, you know, just Google image and add to it, or it's just default?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, if we go to the materials, right? Here's our standing seam metal roof, and if I edit that, right? There's the texture. Maybe I don't want this dark sort of charcoal metal roof. Maybe I like this one. So I'll just go ahead and assign that. And it'll re-render.
Oh, awesome.
Right. So, and if I go at OpenGL, you can see, well, should have.
Is it the fill color that's throwing it?
It might be that the roof wants to be updated. So let's edit the style here.
Here it is.
Yep, it's there. Not sure why it's not rendering that way.
What if you made the fill white?
I can't because that's a style.
I thought I saw it over there.
Nope, there it is. It just needed to be refreshed.
Oh, okay.
And again, if I want to change the spacing of that lighter colored roof, I would do that through the texture. So what I would recommend that you do is that you actually you need to plan this out a little bit, and that you would start with your hatches and the hatches that you want to see associated with the textures, create or import or edit the appropriate hatches. Then when you create or edit your textures, you want to assign a hatch to the texture for hidden line renderings. That's called a surface hatch. Right, and then you would assign the texture to the material. So you kind of want to go from hatch to material to textures as you're building up your libraries. You can start with the material, but then you'll have to interrupt making your material and then go and find a RenderWorks texture. And then you'll realize as you're working on your RenderWorks texture that you want a particular hatch associated with it. And so you'll interrupt making your texture to go, you know, prepare your hatch. So a little bit of planning ahead of time. Start with the hatch, work to your textures, and then do your materials. And again, there's a ton of materials that are right there in the library. So if you in the Vectorworks library, so if I just go to Vectorworks libraries and I go to is it object styles or defaults? It's probably defaults. If I go down to defaults here, materials, I've got UK and US materials, and you know there's quite a few. Concrete, finishes. So these are a good place to start, and then import those and edit them.
Can you create your own?
Yeah, absolutely. Sure, but again, it's probably better if you have a particular hatch or fill or texture in mind for your material to start with that so that you're not interrupting your process.
Right.
They've even got little, like on the little house wrap, the little house wrap material, they even have a little Tyvek symbol or decal. So that's kind of the key to controlling the appearance of your model using materials, right? But then once you've already got your model and you've started assigning materials, you might you might have some questions about it for yourself. So for example, let's say hypothetically that you were building this shed and a building inspector wandered by and mentioned offhand that perhaps your shed was over the setback, hypothetically, of course, and you found yourself honor bound to get it out of the required setback. You know, maybe you were lucky and you had just gotten as far as framing just the floor slab, or maybe you're a little bit further along when this happens. So it might be nice to know how much this darn thing weighs. This is just a kind of a very easy little exercise that sort of starts to demonstrate what we're dealing with. So under tools, there's a report command, and you could create a custom report with the create report command, or what you might want to do is choose a schedule or choose a pre-packaged report. And there's a whole host of reports that are already built in to Vectorworks. So I'm going to go down here to material takeoff. I think it's material takeoff by category. We'll try that. And we'll go ahead and import that. And then let's go down in our resource manager to our worksheets. And let's open that and have a look at it. Yeah, that's the one. So here, this is all pre-formatted and pre-categorized. Can you all see that? Is that too small to see?
I can see.
I can zoom in if you need. So you'll notice that there's an enter material name, right? So these categories, finishes, glazing, specialty equipment, those are just conveniences for the user that they don't have any functional bearing on this particular report. So I'll just go to wood, plastic, composite, and I'm going to go here to my resource manager and go to my materials in my file. And so I'm going to copy. I just did a Control C or Command C, copy there. And then here, I'll just paste the exact name of the material. And so Vectorworks is going to harvest all of the data that is embedded within this material, right? So this material is used in Vectorworks standard style, blah, 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 right? It's getting all of that from over here, this tab, the OmniClass classification, reference ID, and notice that there's a density, almost 33 pounds per cubic feet. It tells me the total quantity, gives me the density, and there's the weight of my lumber. So that might tell me how many friends I need to invite over to move this shed, right? Now that's just whatever material that I've assigned to these framing members, right? And to the wall and to anything else. So if there's an object, since Al mentioned the clip cube, if there's an object like this door type opening, right, that I didn't assign or wasn't able to assign a material to, that might look like it's the wood material, but obviously Vectorworks is going to ignore that for purposes of this calculation. So in other words, your mass takeoff here or your weight takeoff is only going to be as good as your particular you know, as the data that you assign to your model. Come back here, material takeoff. There you go. So for example, under thermal and moisture protection, I'll go to my resource manager and get my sheathing plywood MT, and I'm copying that, which you might not be able to see. And over here, I'll paste in this cell. Let me go ahead and pin that. I will paste in this cell. Right. And so I don't have any cubic feet. That's very interesting. I wonder why that is. That's a good question. Because it should be giving me a volume, perhaps because of the way this material is specified. So let's look at that. So under physical, well, it's given a density. Interesting. I'm not sure why it's not picking up the volume of the plywood that's in the roof and in the slab. So that's something that probably need to have a look at. Make sure I got that right. Yep. Interesting. So maybe it has to do with the way the worksheet is designed. Or maybe that's a limitation. Let's look at the database headers. Yeah, I'm not sure why that's not working. Let's try the same report, but as a spreadsheet, or I'm sorry, as a database. So we'll choose the schedule.
And on the item above, it looked like it either gave you area or volume. I'm not sure, but.
Oh yeah, let's look at that. Yeah, so maybe that's the problem. Let's try this. Let's do this. Let's go ahead and insert. Maybe because it's looking at moisture protection, it's only looking at area there. So let's insert a couple of rows. We'll copy that and paste here. We'll cut and we'll paste. Nope, sadly, that didn't do it. I might have to look into this. Let me look at the database report to see if there's any difference in the database versus the spreadsheet report. And if not, I'll have to look into it offline.
Is there anything about these spreadsheets that need to be updated? And therefore you make a change. If you don't update, you won't see the change?
No, they're updating. They're updating on their own. Yeah. So I think that might be a function of the material for the being as a component in a slab or a roof. So I'm going to need to look into that and get back to everybody. You know, this is the first iteration of this tool, so I'm not surprised that there might be a few gaps here and there in just how pervasively it's implemented throughout the whole Vectorworks ecosystem. But I'll look into that and get back to the group. I think it's a pretty interesting kind of development. I can see where this would really, with a little bit of refinement, have some legs. Now, for some uses, you know, probably not worth retooling. I can see where landscape designers, architects, and so forth would really take huge advantage of this, because a lot of that work is appropriate quantity takeoffs of, you know, how much mulch you need, or how many pavers you might need, or how heavy is that load of stone going to be, and likewise for some basic sort of engineering information for some exotic geometry, right? You could just do some 3D modeling, even if you don't use the plugin objects of steel structures, pergolas, columns, and whatnot, and very quickly and accurately be able to determine what they weigh. So I think it's a pretty cool thing, and certainly my knowledge of it is far from complete. But hopefully this will encourage some of you or some of us to dig a little deeper and see how that might play well with our workflow, or sort of expand some of the things that we can do. Any other questions I cannot answer? Because I don't know.
Yeah, I have a question. I've had difficulty using the eyedropper tool with materials.
Okay.
It looks like in my eyedropper tool, that's an attribute that can be selected, but I haven't been able to actually implement it. For example, if you want to take the eyedropper tool from the, whatever that panel is, and put it over the concrete block.
So let's look at, make sure that material is selected here.
Down at the bottom.
Yep. So in this case, I'm not able to pick up the attributes of this joist because it's buried right deep in the within the component of the plugin object. So if I've got a material, so for example, let me close this. So if I want to go ahead and throw this material over here, or here, OSB, that's going to look all kinds of wrong. Big block of OSB. And now I pick that up and I put it down here. That works fine.
Okay.
And that's because these are just extrusions. And so there's no ambiguity as to what element the material is being applied to. It's being applied to the element as a whole.
Right.
But this structural member has a structural core, it has a cover. Each of those might have a material. It's for the same reason that you can't drag and drop the material from the resource manager onto the object, then the eyedropper is not going to work. Now, if you have two, if I have two like objects, then that should go ahead and work. So for example, let's go to 2D attributes here and 3D attributes and just go by object, right? And do no rendering on this. I could be wrong, but it stands to reason that the eyedropper, provided that I have the plugin parameters selected, right, that ought to be able to apply those from a structural member to a structural member. It's not, can't pick up structural member to extrusion or extrusion. Now I could do like an extrusion to a sweep, that would work just fine. Or an extrusion to a solid subtraction, because there's no sort of ambiguity as to what these things are, right?
I think I just discovered the problem is that I could not transfer that material attribute because it was a simple shape I had, but it was a member of a group. And even though I ungrouped it, I thought that would work. I just completely ungrouped everything in that system that I had, and then it worked. So the shape that I had was
okay.
a group, and I had to ungroup it entirely in order for it to take that material attribute. And then it worked.
There you go, because the group as a whole didn't have a material assigned
Right,
to
the
it.
same.
So here's an extrusion, here's a subtraction, right? I can go ahead and eyedropper from here to here, and that's going to work just fine.
There were a couple of chat questions too, Francois.
Oh, chat questions. I always forget the chat. Where's the chat? What's an Omni class? That's a classification system for materials. I don't use it, so I don't know. I mean, I don't use it, so I can't give you details other than it's just a classification system for materials, like, you know, out in the world, not just in Vectorworks. Yeah, so that's a good question. How's the texture governed on a material? So here's a structural member. I've got a texture. I could give it none, right? So no texture, class texture, texture. It's not paying any attention to that. So I think the answer is that the material texture is what's governing in the case of this plugin object. Let me go back to my extrusions. Now here, class texture, none, texture. Right, so for a simple extrusion, the texture from the render tab is going to override the material. But if I deselect material and then reassign it, then that will kind of refresh the texture. I don't know if that answer your question, Harlan? All right. Anything else? Any other questions? Okay, guys. Well, thank you very much. Appreciate your dropping by. And if you find out anything new and exciting about materials, please, share it.
Thanks, Francois.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thanks.
All right. Bye-bye.